For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On Talking Point this week, we have Ambassador Pankaj Saran, who's been India's former Deputy National Security Advisor and Ambassador to Russia. Ambassador Saran, good to see you again, sir.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. Nice to see you.
Ambassador, just wanted to, lots of developments in the last week or so. Just wanted to get your thoughts on why you think, say, what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said in his statements when he met his counterpart Sergei Lavrov, kind of shows that India is willing to show its hand, I think is the word you used, not to mediate, but to facilitate dialogue and diplomacy in the Russia versus Ukraine war.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think, his visit was very much part and parcel of normal India-Russia relations.
Sure.
And it's part of the annual calendar of visits. So, as I have been saying, I mean, in the normal course, this would have actually been business as usual. But because of the Ukraine conflict, there's a lot of attention to this. And I think what I have taken away from the visit and his public statements is a very robust approach to the bilateral relationship. And some of the statements that he has made are very forward-looking, very positive. And this is obviously signaling not just to the Russians, but I think also to the rest of the world that our relationship with Russia remains intact, regardless of what is happening in Ukraine. So this is one point which I think we can take away from it. Secondly, on the Ukraine issue, obviously it was discussed, he said it, and it is good that they discussed it because this is on the top of the agenda. I don't think mediation would be the right word to use, actually. I think what they are now talking about, and yesterday also the minister in an interview clarified, what he's talking about more is the building of a certain kind of public opinion in the international community on the need to de-escalate or to reduce the collateral damage on the rest of the world. And in particular, he's been talking about the global south.
There's been a lot of, again, in your article, you talked about these leaks in the American media about India or other facilitators. Where do you read the nuance on that? Plus, of course, reports suggesting that the White House has told Zelensky to tone down his rhetoric.
I think we should be very careful of these leaks because, the factual basis of these leaks is highly questionable. And the reference to India also in those leaks is something we have to really be careful about because we don't know the intent. I mean, is it the intent that India somehow prevails upon Russia or to rope in India into this exercise? Because frankly speaking, there is no dearth of so-called mediators, either in Europe or in the United States. And the fact of the matter is that these powers know each other better than we will ever know them. So I would be cautious in over-interpreting these leaks. Of course, we have to understand why those leaks have taken place and what is the purpose of those leaks. For me, what is more interesting is the leak about the fact that there is some advisory being given to Zelensky to take it easy. That for me, if it is true, and if it is kind of has some, roots in some kind of real analysis, that is more interesting.
Is there a role for countries or leaders to play in, again, not using the word mediation, but facilitation? There are again reports suggesting that India helped in the grain blockade crisis or even on the fighting around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Those are specific instances. But if you just look at either countries or people who have been mentioned as possible players, Mexico's attempt at the UN, I think, failed. They said the Pope, Narendra Modi, and the UN Secretary General. Widodo went to both Moscow and Kyiv for the G20. He wanted to invite both. Putin, of course, is not going for that. Israel, Turkey, Do you see any role?
Yeah, see, there's a lot of kite flying in this business, and this is the open season for this kind of thing. And you made a very important point. There is a huge difference between talking of countries and talking of individuals. Mediators at the end of the day are always individuals. Whether it was Jimmy Carter in 1978 for the Camp David Accord, or George Mitchell for the Northern Ireland Belfast Agreement, finally mediation boils down to a personality. And the country, of course, is important, but what is much more important is the relationship between the protagonists and the person who's trying to facilitate. So I think we have to make that very important distinction. That's the first thing. On the choice of so-called mediators or facilitators, yes, I mean, all these people have tried. UAE has gone, Saudi has offered, China has offered, Erdogan has actually not just offered, but he's been involved in the grain deal. So there is this whole bevy of leaders who are trying to get in. I mean, I don't know who's the right person, but obviously it reflects that there is a lot of concern. The last point I would like to say is it's a political call. Do you think you need to mediate, or do you think that the parties have enough communication channels between them to manage and to tone it down and to de-escalate? In my opinion, the problem is not just between, say, Ukraine and Russia, or Europe and Russia, or Washington and Moscow, but it is also among the 27 members of the European Union. I mean, for example, Estonia and Italy and France, they have very different views about how to deal with Russia. So finally they do have a consensus. But when anyone tries to facilitate or to work as a broker, you have to be careful. And also I should say that there is a whole mediation industry in Europe and in the US. So the question is whether you want to get in at all. Then we'll come to the question of whether you will succeed, or you have taken the political call whether it is even advisable to get into this.
Again, India, Russia and the surrounding geopolitics, nothing in the statements, public announcements, but I wonder if anything happened privately. The Russia-China relationship, Ambassador, and the recent developments again in terms of the German Chancellor visiting Beijing and meeting Xi Jinping. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I found the visit of the German Chancellor quite interesting because it basically shows that while you're faced with this crisis in Europe and you're basically pitted against Russia as Europe, and you are the biggest engine of growth in Europe, you actually go to China. And I am not sure whether the Russians would be very pleased to see the German Chancellor being feted in Beijing. Considering that Russia and China are supposed to be such close strategic partners. So the image of having Germany being feted in Beijing will not look good in Moscow. That's the first thing. Second thing is, for us it is very important that Germany knows fully well the dynamic between India and China and the state of the India-China relations. And so if Germany chooses to build its own relationship with China, there is no reason why it should have any objection or difficulty with India doing the same thing with Russia. And that applies not only to Germany, but to the entire European Union. That if you can continue your relationships with China, we can also do the same with Russia for our own national interests.
And your reading of the current situation in the war, Ambassador, I mean, Kherson has, depending on who you read or want to believe, it's either a surrender, a trap, the Russians call it strategic regrouping. How do you see that playing out?
It's interesting. I mean, the smoothness with which this has happened is very intriguing. It's difficult to make out what it is because there is too much of fog of war in this. Now, it could be a retreat, it could be a military defeat, but it could also be part of a more medium-term strategy. I think this war is not finishing tomorrow. We are going to see a lot of twists and turns in this whole thing, and there will be localized battles. Ukraine is a large country, but the focus of the attention of the Russian strategy seems to now be converging on, as we had already and always anticipated, on the eastern flank of Ukraine. And I have heard, in fact, in one of your programs, a very interesting term used by one of your Russian guests, talking about the creation of a buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine. That's a really interesting concept. So what we can only at this point say with some degree of certainty is that the eastern flank is of primary interest to Russia. And within that, it's the northeast more than the southeast. Although in an ideal situation, the Russians would want to have a corridor from the northeast right down to Crimea, and keep the Azov Sea also completely out of bounds for Ukraine. But as maybe a second best option to at least make sure, in a minimalist kind of a scenario, to have control only over the two republics of the Donbass and let the other two maybe have partial control or let it go. And Kherson is one of those. So I think we are going to see, the problem is that we try to want to have instant judgments, instant analysis. It's not happening because, by its nature, war is something in which strategies are made behind closed doors, and no one is actually privy to them. So,
and how do you see, what is the role of winter playing in the conflict, and also the fears of nuclear escalation?
On the winter, I think, the Russians are masters at fighting during the winter, and so are the Ukrainians. I mean, they are the same blood and the same climate, and I've traveled across that region. So it's sparse, it's barren, although it's of course also, it's also fertile, but it's huge. I mean, the expanse is huge. So winter will definitely have an impact. It will make it much more difficult, and it will test both the Ukrainians and the Russians. But they will dig in. I mean, that's their plan. I mean, the Russians, for them, winter is second nature. Insofar as the nuclear aspect is concerned, I think enough has been said by both sides in the last couple of weeks on the whole nuclear issue. And I just read that the Americans and Russians are opening talks on nuclear control and confidence building. So we'll see. I mean, we should not sensationalize this nuclear saber rattling. We should keep a very close watch on it. But considering that they are all nuclear weapon powers, the United States, Russia, and of course UK and France, we have to keep that in mind, that there is going to be, and there will be, a very high degree of nuclear maturity. So why these statements are being made, who's making them, that's a separate discussion. But I would not over sensationalize these statements beyond saying that they are obviously not good, and we have to keep a close watch, but that's it.
How do you see the US midterm elections playing a part in this? That red wave hasn't happened. Even if the Republicans get both houses, it will be a much smaller majority. Could that affect the massive influx of both arms and money into Ukraine and consequently affect the position on the ground?
Yeah, I think the results are still coming out, but what it appears to be is that the House might go to the Republicans. The Senate, we don't know. But broadly speaking, the Republican approach is more internal and inward looking. They are more focused on the Make America Great Again kind of agenda. And I suspect that if they take control of the House, passage of funds and monies is going to be more difficult for the administration than in the past. And their approach to Ukraine and the war is going to be more conservative and less ideological than the Democrats. So it could possibly make funding of weapons to Ukraine from the US budget slightly more difficult. It could help to roll back a little bit of the aggressive current Democrat focus on Ukraine, but we'll have to see. But yes, I mean, if it helps in the reduction of tension between Russia and the US, and therefore Ukraine, which is basically part of the bigger game, it'll be good for everyone.
Yeah, again, coming back to India, Russia, Sergei Lavrov talked about trade reaching 17 billion in that pursuit of 50 billion by 2025. Ironically, the spurt or the spike has come because of the war and India's trade, whether it's food, fertilizer, crude. Russia is now our biggest crude supplier, 22%. Wow.
Yeah.
But do you see that as a short-term thing because of what's happening, or medium-term in terms of the war? In terms of India-Russia's economy, which has been lagging in terms of a potential?
You know, the basic problem with the absence of any exponential growth in the India-Russia trade and economic relationship is actually the lack of real economic reform within Russia, and the inability of the Russian economy to reform itself and to grow at, say, the pace at which the Chinese economy or the Indian economy is growing. So that it's a structural problem, and until and unless there is rebalancing within the Russian economy, the sources of growth for economic and investment and trade cooperation are going to remain limited. But having said that, I think what two sides today are viewing is, because of all the geopolitical situation and circumstances, how we can actually now leverage our mutual strengths much more purposefully. For example, in the case of natural resources, in the case of energy, in the case of fertilizer, these are items which are available in abundance in Russia. And the Russian economy today is in desperate need of foreign exchange, of money, of liquidity. And if we can put in place mechanisms to tap these, which were only being discussed in the past, but today the time has come to actually go beyond discussion and resolve all the little irritants and problems, and actually go into a very, very major collaborative partnership where we use Russian resources for the development of India and vice versa, there will be nothing like it. And I think energy is today in the forefront of this new paradigm, and we must do it because this is the best way to, from an Indian point of view, to utilize the opportunities which are now emerging in Russia for meeting our national development needs.
How do you see the G7 attempts at imposing a price cap? How does that affect us?
You know, I think enough has been discussed on this price cap thing. I think it is not going to be of use or of any help to the world economy as such. And the Russians will respond. I mean, you know, they're not going to take it lightly. And we will have a big say in it as one of the largest consumers in the world. So we will continue to import oil at the best price that we can get, and that is perfectly valid proposition.
The Americans have also accepted it, even officially. I think yesterday in one of the State Department spokesperson said that Russian oil should be in there in the market to keep world prices down.
Exactly.
In terms of defense cooperation, do you see the war affecting us? I know we've asked you this question, many other people. Do you see any change, both in terms of Russia and, say, we get equipment like gas turbines for naval ships from Ukraine as well? Do you see any effect?
From what I can read from the Indian official statements, so far we are okay. But let's see in the future, I mean, say 2-3 years from now, and because the war is still going on, how much it is going to impact on their manufacturing capabilities is something to be watched. But what I have heard is that till now we are okay in terms of our preparedness, our serviceability, etc. But at the same time, as you know, and everyone knows, we are diversifying. And we are also trying to do more in India. So these are all medium to long-term projects.
You mentioned the German Chancellor's visit won't go down well either in Moscow or New Delhi for the reasons that nuances that you explained in Beijing. But do you visualize any stage coming where Russia and China, where Russia has to choose between China and India? And would that affect us?
You know, see, one of the hallmarks of a major power is that it can, at the same time, conduct different kinds of relationships, and it has the ability to not get into a situation where it has to choose. Frankly, we are doing that also in our own way. So I think the Russians have realized increasingly the role that India can play for their own geopolitical purposes. and that putting all their eggs in the Chinese basket is not exactly the best approach. In fact, the whole Primakov strategy, which has been talked about, was actually to look at Asia through China and India.
But
And
Russia as a lead.
Russia as a lead, but also Russia focusing on both powers. So not look at a unipolar Asia. And I think from what I can make out, I think this trend in the elites in Russia, in Moscow, is there to stay, and they realize the value of India for them. So of course they would not like problems between India and China, but that is something they cannot control. And they may or may not have at some stage or the other to face this stark choice. They are just keeping their fingers crossed that they don't have to.
Ambassador, as always, a pleasure picking your brains. Thank you for allowing us to that repeatedly.
No, you're most welcome. Pleasure to talk to you every time.
Thanks again. And to all our viewers, you can of course follow all our social media handles. Do follow our Telegram channel as well. There's a scroll at the bottom of the screen if you want to join that. We'll give you when we put up the latest articles on our website or videos like this one on YouTube. You can also help support us. There's a UPI QR code that's flashing on your screen, and the link is also in the YouTube descriptor. This is The Talking Point with the Ambassador Pankaj Saran. I'm Amitabh Revi.